He beat me, he kicked me, he punched me. When I called the police, I was told that I had to stay in the home because they could not do anything if I was not there.
In 1991, 4 men entered her house and robbed them. They dragged her out and serially raped her.
And the police officer said that he must prove she was raped by inserting his fingers into Sandra's vagina.
To buy milk for her child, she had to sell her blood 3 times.
Got into my bed, and there was an enormous erect penis drawn on the sheet, which I threw off. I wasn't allowed another sheet.
2 semaines après l'agression.
2 weeks after the attack, I decided to lay charges. And the nightmare continues.
June 1993, governments from around the world converged on Vienna for the United Nations World Conference on Human Rights. They came to assess and reaffirm the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by member states in 1948. Human rights activists came too, to highlight human rights abuses, to lobby their governments, and to ensure genuine progress was made. Upstairs in the Great Hall, 171 member states met and deliberated. The world had changed dramatically since 1948. There was a greater recognition that respect for human rights was the key to international peace, security, and prosperity. And yet, gross human rights violations continued around the globe. It was the largest human rights gathering ever. But this time there were new voices to consider. Thousands of women came from all over the world to challenge the international community's failure to promote and protect women's human rights. They came to tell their stories, to testify before the world at the Global Tribunal on violations of women's human rights. Relegated to the downstairs of the Vienna Center, the women finalized their preparations. After 2 years of organizing hearings and a worldwide petition, they were determined their voices would be heard upstairs at the official UN World Conference.
And I think here in Vienna, what we're really hoping for is that because this is a time, for the first time in 25 years, that the United Nations is re-looking at its human rights mechanisms and standards, that this is going to be the time and the opportunity for us to have our say, our input into that process, and hopefully try to get some of the things that are important to us on the agenda of the world human rights system.
It was important that women claimed the right to make their rights visible at the international arena, because that's the way in which they can also have the possibility to press their own governments to be accountable, for the protection of their rights at home.
So many things have happened to you since that time that more than likely you have a whole legal brief in your head as to what should be done about this. That's the job of the judges, right? And the legal advisors. Give the story of exactly what happened, so the judges have something to relate to.
The judges are very eminent people. This is not a legal body, but we're hoping that because of their eminence and because of their expertise in specific areas that they will be dealing with or handling, we hope that the statement will have a persuasive impact and effect on the UN and UN system.
We are going to listen and then make recommendations to the UN and nation states about what should be done to really put in place the understanding that women's rights are human rights, and put in place means of making these rights real for women.
It's one thing to think in the abstract and feel empowered and really want to come and give your story and to document your story. It's another thing to be confronted with the stress of having to do that. The women themselves are busy preparing their testimonies. Today we have worked closely in the sub-theme groups on how to, sharpen them up, cut out pieces that the women feel they can dispense with, so that they're really keeping those parts of the testimony that they really want to get across.
Many of you have waited a long time for this moment when women will announce to the world that we are tearing down the wall of silence that has prevented the world from recognizing the abuse of women's human rights everywhere. And to help us tear down that wall, we have brought here women from 25 different countries who will testify to the nature and extent of human rights abuse in their parts of the world. We hope that you will all listen closely, hear the stories, and remember that behind each of these stories stands the lives of millions of women.
As for me, I lived in a small village. I had a happy family life. I had 3 older brothers and sisters and 2 younger ones. The older ones were already married. I was 16, attending school. One day, the head of the village and my village unit leader came to our house, accompanied by a man in military uniform. They said they would send me to Daeshintai. They said, Japan is at war. There is a shortage of hands to make clothes for the soldiers, and therefore they needed Korean girls. They assured my mother that it is not a dangerous place to go, and I would return home when I became old enough to get married. We arrived in Guangdong, China. They took us to offices, sitting behind a row of desks, medical officers. They told us to undress, which I never did before, in front of men. I was terrified. I was trembling and shaking. Upon seeing that, he really meant, I ran, but was caught and beaten. The beating was so savage that my cheeks were completely numb. Then he raped me. My bottom was ripped, bleeding. So we stayed on doing what they forced us to. Soldiers came and lined up, like soldiers lined up for the canteen, each holding a rubber thing, a condom, and lubricant. I was laying legged with my 2 legs wide open. Soldiers came in, one after the other. No time to undress. One pulled his pants down, did it, and left. Then another came in. There was no time even to eat. I spent the whole day this way. I was unable to get up afterwards. The lower part of my body was too weak to sustain me. This torture went on for several years. I was dragged from one place to the other. The liberation came at last. Strangely enough, soldiers disappeared and stopped coming. My body was destroyed. My soul shattered. I did come back home after 7 years of suffering, although my body was completely demolished beyond repair. I could not bear a child. How could I, after the years of that horrible abuse?
The people making war during the colonial period or during the present period are not the women. The people developing armies, exploiting foreign aid, and giving foreign aid to countries that have been documented as terrorist states are not the women. The people picking up the pieces, the people being raped, sexually and otherwise physically harassed, yes, we are the women.
The pictures you see are of women and children.
Являются психологической причиной для роста конфликта кровь за кровь.
Women have been tortured with knitting needles, and severed women's heads were attached to armored personnel carriers. Scalps taken from people who are still alive, and women's breasts are put on tanks. These are the horrors that are the psychological reason for the growing conflict.
Ola Ghazali from Jerusalem, who was threatened with rape and thus confessed at a military detention center. Ola states, then I was taken back to the first room, and the officer who previously interrogated me threatened me once more with rape if I didn't confess.
Well, I first want to say that I come from Belgrade, and that's where the seat of the government is, who started the war in Croatia and who started the war in Bosnia, who keeps on that war, and that I want, first of all, to send all my solidarity love to my sisters from Bosnia and from Croatia who are here. First of all, we have learned that women from all three nationalities have been raped, and not only three, there have been also Gypsies and Albanians too. And some of them told us how they were systematically raped, and some of them told us how they were raped by their neighbors who were soldiers at that time, or by the soldiers who were the same nationalities.
Otkad je došla u izbjeglički kamp, ne spava.
The nightmare that haunts her in her sleep is going back to the place where she left her 4-month-old baby alive. She was fleeing from her village where her home was burning. She was carrying her twins in her arms, traveling by night and sleeping in the shelters of the Second World War.
The women of Bosnia and Herzegovina are at school of survival, and they teach their children that the first rule of survival is defense and self-defense. In this war, in which we women have suffered the most, we have learned that this tremendous tragedy must not be repeated.
We have a session here in which we've heard abominable testimony of incredible cruelty, and I ask myself, when we're talking about the rights of women, where are the men? Because it is complex, and it is a matter of conditioning, but at some point it is the responsibility of the leadership of human rights institutions and organizations, particularly throughout the world, to recognize that there are important civil and political, cultural, social, and economic rights, yes, that belong to all citizens, men and women, but there are a number of evil, abominable violations of rights that are exclusively inflicted upon women, and we must pay attention to them. War crimes committed must be war crimes prosecuted. Justice made available to the claims of men in the past must be made available for the rights of women today.
I will begin my story in 1966, when my natural father was killed in Vietnam. At the age of 26, my mother was widowed, unemployed, and responsible for the care of my sister and I, ages 2 and 4. During this time of emotional vulnerability and economic uncertainty, she met a priest who began dating her. Within 2 years, he left the priesthood to marry my mother, and he legally adopted my sister and I. In 1975, when I was 10 years old, my mother was diagnosed with having an inoperable brain tumor. After 2 years of chemotherapy, radiation, and other surgeries, she died. While she was still in a coma, my stepfather had come to me and told me that the doctors were concerned about me because her tumor had been the result of an inherited immune disorder that had only affected fair-skinned females who had a history of childhood illnesses. This fit my profile and distinguished me from my sister, who was dark-complected. He went on to explain that if this was not taken care of during adolescence when there was a chance of reversal, I would inevitably die at a young age, just like my mother. He had detailed the cure, a new quote-unquote therapy involving sexual intercourse that would provide the necessary semen to strengthen my immune system. The donor of the semen could not be a blood relative due to the hereditary nature of the disease. This made him a compatible donor. He went on to say that I would have to be on medication and that he would have to endure painful injections in his testicles. At this time, I was 12 years old. Therapy took place every night for the first couple of years. He had given me pills which I had later discovered were tranquilizers. Although I knew this therapy was a sexual act, I believed this was a medical treatment that my life depended on. Regardless of being diagnosed as suffering from a sexually transmitted disease on several occasions, the medical community failed to investigate the cause. When I was 16, my sister moved to college and my stepfather's behavior towards me changed. He began to demand physical affection from me, something he had never done before. He became increasingly possessive, restricting me from any kind of social activity. I was frightened by this and decided to seek out the school's psychologist. I was forced to explain. She had been the first person I had ever told. When the police confronted my stepfather, he denied everything and accused me of lying and of insanity. After a grand jury hearing, my stepfather was indicted and charged with first, second, and third-degree aggravated sexual assault of a minor. He was given a bail of $10,000 and only had to put up 10% of that to walk free. Before the trial date, a psychological evaluation of my stepfather had been completed, classifying him as a sadistic, manipulative, compulsive, and repetitive child molester. In the end, my stepfather pleaded guilty to second and third degree aggravated sexual assault and was sentenced to 7 to 9 years incarceration at a treatment facility for sexual offenders. He was released from the facility after a mere 18 months. He lives in financial comfort in the next county, a mere 30 minutes from my current home. I have heard he has married a woman who speaks no English. I know now that I was not his first victim, and I am sadly convinced that I am not his last.
Pero lo más difícil de nosotras, las sobrevivientes de incesto,
the most difficult thing for us as survivors of incest is to understand the silence that surrounds us. I remember from the age of 3, my father began putting his penis in my mouth. It was so difficult to recognize it was my father's fault. Instead, it was easier to think that I had made it up, that it was my fault.
Yo lo había inventado. Me llegó la esperanza de que
I was given hope to go on by brave women like you and me, who have been able to break through to the society which is so insensitive to our suffering.
Insensible de nuestro dolor. Yo quisiera pedirle a las Naciones Unidas,
I would like to ask the United Nations and the judges who are present to expose the problem of domestic violence in order to break the social and private legitimacy, so it is seen as a large problem it is.
Y que se vuelva un problemón público. Esto ha sido un problema común cotidiano en nuestros países.
It has been a common daily problem in our countries, and it's time to make it a social-political problem.
Así que les dejo la palabra a ustedes.
So I pass it on to you.
Y hemos escuchado esta mañana.
We have heard cases that are representative from all over the world. It shows that domestic legislation does not give any answer, that we women do not exist, and that the abuses against us are committed just because we are women, even though the laws are in the penal codes. In practice, they do not constitute a crime.
Y es por esa razón que debemos.
That is why we must continue fighting until violence against women is considered a violation of fundamental human rights.
a los derechos fundamentales que como persona tenemos. Esta lucha nuestra
Rights that as human beings we should all have. Our fight that has just started has to continue.
el año entrante.
Well, because it was pretty much of a new area, not violations, obviously, but the whole world of human rights, we had to get ourselves educated. We had to train ourselves. We had to find out what had the UN done, what had the UN been not able to do. We had to find out about conventions, what was the difference between conventions and declarations, between resolutions and recommendations, what was the difference between what governments signed and what they ratified. I mean, it was a whole new world for us.
Why suddenly we hear less feminism, more women's rights as human rights? That's an interesting question that one has to ask oneself. As being an old feminist, I realize that human rights is the mainstreaming of feminism. That's what makes the difference here. That's why women's groups started to be interested in the human rights groups. They have the mechanism that we don't have. They have the power to be heard that the women's movement yet did not acquire, that is now acquiring. That's why human rights is so important. Whether human rights organizations are still going to take on that task after Vienna, it's for women to continue the struggle for human rights to be educated.
But of course, the reality of life, the reality of struggle, the reality of having to work your feminism through your systems, your job, through your profession, to deal with the world, with the establishment, you start using your brain, your tactics, and you plan, and you get clever at it. And so a lot of the feeling get again sort of put in the back burner. Yesterday, the first half of the day, and I'm glad I testified in the afternoon, because through sitting and listening to all these women, just my barriers, all these barriers of feeling, the barriers to feeling, which sort of comes from intellectualizing, which we have to do. We have to do to keep, getting on. Just kept being removed one by one, just like, the wrappings of a very precious thing in the middle. And then I just became very much in touch with my inner feelings, my pain, my own pain, wherever it comes from.
Grażyna is a woman from Poland. She did not dare to come here herself, but she has allowed us to tell her story as she told it to us. I used to work in the shipbuilding industry, but since the so-called revolution, there is no more work for me. The economic crisis has turned my life upside down. I'm divorced, I have 2 children. In September 1991, I'd been working in a restaurant in Yugoslavia and had just come to the end of my contract. Through some acquaintances, I met a man, John. He asked me whether I was interested in going to work in a restaurant in Germany, where I would earn 3 times as much as I would in Yugoslavia for the same kind of work. I was interested because the situation in Yugoslavia was becoming more and more unstable. A few days later, he introduced me to another man called Robert, who said that he was the manager of a restaurant in Germany. It was agreed that I would work as a kitchen help, and I would be paid a salary between 1,500 and 1,800 D-marks per month. Grażyna said that was the answer to all her dreams. She would be able to do so much if we could just work for a year and earn that much money a month. A few days later, Robert came with 2 other men to fetch me. There was another woman with him who was also going to work in Germany. At the border with Germany, I had to give him my passport because he somehow convinced me that it was better if he was the one to hand it to the immigration officers. He never gave it back to me afterwards. On the way, we stopped at a hotel somewhere in Germany. There, they told me that I had to work as a prostitute. I protested, but to no avail. When I kept on refusing, Mario raped me while Robert took photographs. He threatened to send the photographs to my mother if I continued to resist. In the Netherlands, I was forced to work as a prostitute in a window in a street full of prostitution windows. They also said that it was no use going to the police because they were paying the police too. I had to earn at least 600 guilders a day. If I did not earn enough, I was beaten. I pretended submission, I worked and laughed in the hope that my captors would relax their guard and to avoid more physical assaults. But I was still determined to escape. Finally worked. In an unguarded moment, I fled, but not knowing where to go. I was interviewed by the contact officer for the Ministry of Justice. I told him how I'd come to the Netherlands, how I was forced to work as a prostitute, and that I was afraid to return to Poland, because I feared that the traffickers might take revenge on me for running away, and because of the compromising photos that Joseph had made and that he would send them to my mother. But the Ministry of Justice decided that I did not fulfill their criteria for recognition as a political refugee and rejected my request for asylum. And meanwhile, my mother had informed me that some strange people had visited her and were asking where I was. So how could I go back and what could I do? Nobody knows how many women have been victimized in this way in the whole of Europe, in America, and all over the world.
I stand here today to testify on behalf of many girls and women who had no choice when parts of their bodies were removed in the name of culture and social conformity. In my society, that conformity means the cutting of essential parts of the genitals of women. And because they are women, their fate is to marry, give their husbands sexual pleasure, and give birth to many children while suffering in silence, obedience, and acceptance. Because as women, we are made economically and socially powerless, most of us have little chance to say no. Her name is Miami. The memory of their screams